Thank you, and good afternoon. My work very much comes from the built environment, but it's an experiment that I think, or I'm hoping, can be applied to shoreline management everywhere. So, Seattle Public Utilities provides drinking water to over 1 million customers regionally here. We provide drainage and wastewater services and solid waste services to city's Seattle residents. We've been looking at sea level rise for about 6 years. Primarily, it impacts our infrastructure along the coast and our assets related to our drainage infrastructure, our pump stations, our outfalls, and I'll show some photos of those in a moment. It's about our third approach to planning for sea level rise over that span of time. We're trying to find ways to make it relevant and to make to inspire some action, and that's very much why I want to share this new approach with you, because one, that we've encountered some issues with GIS, and we want to make it as efficient as possible to map and to communicate these things, this issue. Again, we want to make sure that people are invited and encouraged to act when they see this information. And finally, we are communicating to the public, and we're communicating to engineers internally, and we're trying to streamline that process. And before I go any further, I just want to make some quick acknowledgments. This work definitely wouldn't have happened without previous studies going all the way back to Andy Hobb in the city of Olympia and Sasha Peterson, who's been pretty active here. He came up with some of the very first maps, the Climate Impacts Group, and the work that King County did, Laura Wharton and Sean O'Neill, and now John Phillips, and right here at UW, University Urban Design and Planning Program, some advisors there helped me develop a case study, and then I also want to acknowledge the work of Paul Fleming at Seattle Public Utilities to develop this robust climate change program, and of course hire me. So back in 2008, many of you are probably familiar with this report that came from right here, Moat et al., the Climate Impacts Group. We were pleased because it gave the city of Seattle a number to work with. We didn't have to work with global numbers. We took the scenarios, the medium and the high projections, and walked over to the GIS department and said, okay, let's put these on a map. Let's see what it looks like. Others had done it, but not for Seattle. So we did that, and it was quite a bit of a GIS exercise to work with the digital elevation model and the LiDAR and to come up with, well, where is zero? Let's start with mean, high water. So we had to adjust the digital elevation model and then add on the layers. It was a little bit more complicated than some of us would have liked. And on top of the fact that there's uncertainty already in the projections themselves, LiDAR has a margin of error of 6 inches to a foot, depending on the surface and where you are. It was based on a 2001 Puget Sound LiDAR Consortium survey. But still, we made these maps, and it was a good first step, a good assessment tool. And Paul and I, we started to go around the city. It's different departments, and Paul called me a strange bird in an earlier talk, so I'm just going to point out that he has a face for the radio, right? No, he wanted me to say that. Here we are at a city council press conference during a high tide, in which there was high pressure, so the tide was suppressed. It didn't really work out the way we wanted it to, but still, we went around to various city departments and shared these maps and said, look, we got to do something. We have to, because Seattle Public Utilities can't act in isolation. We have to make sure that we're working in coordination with our departments. We have to make sure that the roads to the infrastructure that we want to adapt are going to work themselves. But you know, we met quite a few blank faces or stunned audiences. People started thinking, oh, well, what about the locks? And we're building a tunnel, right? And I've got a home on the Hood Canal. Is that going to be okay? So it didn't, you know, it took a little while to sink in. And so meanwhile, we wanted to make sure that SPU was in a good position. So we took an asset management approach to adaptation, and we just, using GIS, developed an inventory of every single asset we have in those layers, from a little maintenance hole like this to big old pump stations where we could look at weir elevations within the pump stations and so forth. We went out and did surveys and checked to see how many of these maintenance holes had locking lids. That is, could the tide get in or out or not? And it was good. But we still, this was great, and we were mainstreaming this information and adaptation within utility, but we still wanted to make sure our partners citywide were on board. Then we started, we started getting into these projects like the seawall, and they had heard that we had been doing this work. So, they came with us, came to us with these site plans and these elevations and these designs, and we started thinking about it differently. It wasn't just a map. We could see these elevations on plans, and we would meet with an engineer who was developing a water quality treatment facility along the Duwamish River, and she said to us, well, I just need to know, here's my street elevation, and how high do you want me to build it? And we had these maps that said, well, at 2050 it'll be this high, and 2100 it'll be this high, but it didn't exactly match up. The maps had these fixed times, and we could see if it was underwater or not. But here are some engineers on a couple of projects were saying, no, we need to know these elevations, and is it going to flood? Is it going to overtop? And will that impact be tolerable or not? And then shortly thereafter, we had a big high tide. This is December 17th, 2012. This event has already been mentioned a few times. This tide, at first we thought it beat, but it looks like it tied our highest water level on record in the city, and this was due to a 980 millibar low pressure system that came through, and we were on the windy side. I do want to say that this occurred during a king tide event, but I also want to express my annoyance with that term. I mean, I'm not expressly anti-monarchist, but I would love it if this community, as scientists and communicators, could maybe start calling them perihelion tides, or perihelion apogee, or perigee tides, because it really is what it's all about, and not some strange king who you'll see in a second. But nonetheless, this tide happened, and there were 100 homes in West Seattle that had some kind of water coming to the property, 8 of whom required pumping from fire and police, and even Seattle Public Utilities had to come in. But we also noticed this. In some of our maintenance holes, there was just water came right up, and we sent out survey teams, and they went inland, not on this map. Okay, so on this map, you can see the water that's coming over land, that is coming over the levee and spreading out. But inland, there's these little ponds, these little spots. And so what are those? Well, that's where the water is coming up through our drainage infrastructure and through the outfalls and appearing. And so we sent out a survey team during that December 17th, 2012 tide. They opened up the maintenance hole, and we're talking like over half a mile from the Duwamish River, and there was the tide. It was right there. Luckily, we didn't have any rainfall, or very little rainfall, to try to get into the system at that point. But what it did is it verified the maps that we did, because that event corresponded more or less to a 22-inch tide from the Climate Impacts Group report. So we looked at that layer on the map and said, wait a minute, did that happen? And in some cases it did, in some cases it didn't. It really verified the LiDAR performance more than anything else. But it kind of helped us say, okay, well, these maps aren't that bad. We do know that in some areas like Harbor Island, it's a little bit exaggerated because of the LiDAR, and we've talked to them about that. And West Point has some issues there. But again, we've worked with King County on making sure that their system is going to work, because we send a lot of our wastewater there. So anyway, that was an event that got us to think differently about it. And so at around the same time, the National Academies, National Research Council put out their report, which provided a new set of numbers for Seattle. Now, in reality, it didn't differ that much. So a different methodology, different approach, but nothing too striking about it. But at the same time, we had already done an analysis and spent all that time with GIS to try to get it right. And here we are saying, okay, how many, every 5 years, every 7 years, we're going to have to do this over and over again? So what if we just took the digital elevation model and mapped 11 feet NAVD88, 12, 13, 14, go as far as you want. We ended up mapping 11 through 17 feet, so just picking them out, and then reverse engineering. Instead of taking these dates provided by the report and mapping those, we took elevations and then figured out the dates based on the science in the report when those would occur. And so the map is online. It looks like that. I think following this presentation, I'm going to put a nice little explanation on there below it online, but you can go and check it out on our website. Also at the same time, this concept of time of emergence began to become more popular. There was a paper put out by Mora, and it was published in Nature. It showed when various climate variables would be, and someone can probably correct me if I'm wrong, but when the climate would change, the timing would exceed a certain range. And so I think Seattle would have a new regime by 2063 or something. But nonetheless, it picked out a date and said, this is when you're going to have that impact. And so we wanted to be able to say, this is when we're going to have that king tide again. This is when it's going to become not just a 1 in 100 year event, but it's going to become a monthly event, and then maybe way, way, way out daily, depending on some of the high scenarios. So again, we took that science and plotted it, a very rough plot. This is just some basic Excel fits here. Ideally, we would have the equations for the different periods within it. But at the same time, there's quite a bit of uncertainty in the science and in the LiDAR. So what you do is you say, okay, mean high water is 9.01 feet in FD88. That tide was 12.14, so that's a 3-foot rise above mean high water. You go up 3 feet over to the scenario you want, and then down to find the date. I could be using my laser pointer, but I think you get it. And then so 11 feet. That's 2 feet of sea level rise above mean high water today. Or it's also king tide more or less today. And then it's a monthly tide, and then you come up with a range based on the scenarios, and then a daily tide as soon as 2058. And you go on and on for the different measurements. And this is helpful when an engineer comes to you and says, okay, well, I've got this weir, and I want to build it at this elevation. So we can say, this is when you're going to experience monthly inundation in this range. Does it fit with the life cycle of the design? And is that impact tolerable or not? It's been useful in that regard, and part of the reason why I'm here is because I'd love to expand that notion. We had a study done by the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at Seattle University, and they took all of our wastewater pump stations in our CSO sites, combined sewer overflow sites, and figured out the elevations of them all. And the various structures within, and they said, okay, on these dates, it's when it's going to overtop, and they also, not pictured here, they said, they quantified the amount of water in gallons that would go over the top of that weir and for how long, and then they provided some adaptation options, various gates and valves that could be added to it. But it was the first application of time of emergence. And again, our engineers, and we are very much an engineering utility driven by major capital projects. So it's important to make sure that they're on board. Other departments have started to be receptive to this. The Office of Sustainability and Environment commissioned a report that was made by the design firm GGLO. Now, it's not unveiled yet. It'll come out, I think, in October. But I just want to point out that on the front, 2 feet, 3 feet, 5 feet. Whoa, there's no report that says we're going to get 5 feet of sea level, or we're expecting that reaction. But if you go in and you look at the report, well, you can take that and apply it to the tidal return that you want to understand. So this report's going to look at land use. It's going to look at social impacts and jobs and so forth, and it should be pretty interesting. So here's King Canute. I think this was in the 11th century. He thought he could stop the tide. Obviously his subjects were skeptical. That guy looks like Michaela Moroni or something there. Nonetheless, we did this because we wanted to streamline the GIS process so that the next data that comes out, we don't have to run the digital elevation model again. We can just change the dates. And we wanted to get different groups acting. So get more than just engineers, but we want to get different groups acting. And those other two methods are still applicable and still in use. someone wants to know what's going on at 2100, 2050, they can go and do that pretty easily. And so we just want to enhance communications and continue to mainstream sea level rise throughout the utility and then citywide. So thanks, and please join in me in calling it a perihelion tide, which we're reaching a 19-year maximum this year.
Okay.
So we'll have a couple opportunities. So thank you.
Thank you, James.